I would like to speak about, so we've heard a more general introduction to the history of this dialogue between science and theology. On the theology side of it, from Professor Stephen Barr, whom I thank very much for invitation, and as well you, Professor Roszkowski. Thank you both for inviting me. I believe that in those main or longer sessions or longer talks during this session, we will most likely cover some more maybe specific aspects of the history of this dialogue between theology and science. So I would like to do something on teleology. One of the early and very strong criticisms of Darwinian theory of evolution among Christians was precisely this. The claim was made that the emphasis on the role of chance and natural selection undermines the teleological argument for God's existence. So the question, therefore, is whether there is any space for teleological argument in Darwinian's theory of evolution and its interpretation over the years. So first, we probably should go to Darwin himself and see what he says about these aspects of reality, if they exist. So Darwin says at one point in his book that every detail of structure has been produced for the good of its possessor, which you could interpret as a teleological claim. And in addition, it seems to be also referring to the a normative aspect of teleology already, that there is some goodness that is being pursued in changes that happen in organisms. Another example, as natural selection works solely and by and for the good of each being, we can speak about a progress towards perfection. Again, sounds like a sort of teleological claim. But at the same time, the same Charles Darwin says this: in my theory, there is no absolute tendency to progression, excepting from favorable circumstances, and any broad view of purposefulness in evolution would be absolutely fatal to my theory. And then in one of his letters, he would say this: my theology here, he says, is a simple model. I cannot look at the universe as the result of blind chance, yet I can see no evidence of beneficent design or indeed of design of any kind. So because, as you can see, Darwin himself is a little bit perplexed because he is a biologist and not a philosopher, therefore interpretations of what his theory does with or does to an argument about teleology has been ever since he proposed his theory, ever since it has been an object of controversy and debate. Interestingly, those who worked with Darwin at the time when he proposed his theory, we may give an example. Among them, we find those who speak favorably about teleology and its place in Darwin's theory. Asa Gray, one of the first traditionally religious botanists and natural historians who embraced evolution, he says precisely this: we recognize the great service rendered by Darwin to natural science by what? Restoring teleology to it. So instead of having morphology against teleology, we shall have henceforth morphology married to teleology. And Darwin responds to his letter saying, what you say about teleology pleases me, because it doesn't seem that others saw this argument or this aspect of what I'm doing in my theory. Francis Darwin, his son, reflecting on the heritage of his father, says this: one of the greatest services rendered by my father to the study of natural history, again, is the revival of teleology. And last example, Thomas Huxley, who is a declared naturalist and agnostic, who coined the term agnosticism, says something that is actually surprising in the entire debate, because he also acknowledges that, again, one of the most remarkable services to the philosophy of biology rendered by Mr. Darwin is the reconciliation of teleology and morphology. And yet, on the other side, we find those who early on, and this is an example of Hermann von Helmholtz, who was a German physicist and physician. He praises Darwin in 1869 already for bringing the study of biological form under the ambit of mechanism. About 100 years later, we are fast forwarding here, we have David Hall, who is considered to be one of the founding fathers of philosophy of biology, modern contemporary philosophy of biology. He says, from the point of view of contemporary biology, both vitalism and teleology are stone cold dead, and he claims, he would say that Darwin is the one who gets rid of teleology. And two quotations that usually show up in talks of this sort. We have Jacques Monod, who claims that chance alone is at the source of every innovation, pure chance, absolutely free but blind, at the very root of the stupendous edifice of evolution. It is today the sole conceivable hypothesis, the only that squares with observed and tested fact. And Richard Dawkins, who claims that there is no design, no purpose, no evil and good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Now, I bring all those quotations, first of all, to show it to you or prove that there are opposite opinions on this issue, but also it is interesting to pay attention to terminology that is being used in all those references, either favorable or those that show a rather negative approach to teleology. There are different terms that are being used. Teleology, design, purpose. So I believe that in order to understand and bring more clarity to this entire conversation, and in order to be able to answer to the question I asked in the beginning, what, if any, space for teleology might there be in evolutionary theory, we should, I believe, distinguish between three crucial categories here. And these are the categories: teleology, design and function, and vital forces and vitalism, because they are all used in this conversation. Speaking of teleology and in its classical understanding, Aristotle would say that it is one of the causes which are rational explanations of what things are and why they are what they are and why they act and react in a given way. One of those causes, which goes beyond efficient physical interaction or mechanic interaction, is for him precisely a final cause or teleology, which he defines as that for the sake of which a thing is being done, or a good, again he already brings this normative aspect, that can be attained and is proper to a given entity. Now, what is crucial for Aristotle is that this is not a mysterious quasi-efficient cause that acts from the future on what's happening now. Rather, he would see it as a natural tendency, we may say goal-directedness or purposefulness of things, to realize what is proper to their nature, to actualize their powers and dispositions in a way that is right and appropriate to what they are. Importantly for Aristotle, it would be a tendency that does not have to be known or intended by a conscious agent. This is absolutely crucial for him, speaking as a naturalist here. It is absurd to suppose that purpose is not present because we do not observe the agent deliberating on this purpose. So that would be a natural aspect of things to actualize themselves in an appropriate way with respect to what they are. Now, when we think about this naturalistic argument in reference now to God and theology, Aquinas would be the one who would refer to teleology as defined by Aristotle, and he would indeed say that there is an author of all cases of teleology in nature, and this would be God. So therefore he would say that all things desire God as their end. So this teleology comes from God and is always directed to God, and he would emphasize that this refers to a desire that is present in creatures that have intellect or are just sensible creatures, or simply natural things, which philosophers interpret, and it is a just interpretation, that it refers to all entities in the universe. Intellectual, human beings, sensible, animals, and natural plants and inanimate creatures. What is crucial for us here is that we have three stages of reflection that is offered to us. The point of departure is a simple observation of things that seem to act as if they were acting for some goal or end. Now, teleology is being proposed as this one of those causes that make things to be what they are, as an intrinsic causal principle, and then yet another and in a way separate step is to propose God, again, to be the source and ultimate goal of all teleology, this is God who works in nature through natural teleology. Okay, so we have, therefore, and when we speak about God working through natural teleology, we predicate his causation in an analogical way. This is a standard aspect of the Thomistic approach. Now, what is important here? We have an empirical phase, we have a philosophical phase of reflection, and we have a theological phase. And they are all combined, but at the same time, they are distinct steps of this inquiry into nature. Now, when we move to the argument from design and function, we can see a considerable difference here. And obviously, we refer here to William Paley, who was an English clergyman, Christian philosopher, apologist, and Darwin read his book when he was young, and he was fascinated with it, and then he rejected it and vehemently argued against it. What is the argument that Paley proposes, which is then named a design argument or argument from design? The point of departure is, again, observation of biological structures in terms of their complexity and order. And then there is an assumption that there is some sort of functionality of those biological structures. And then another step in this inquiry, which brings the claim that those biological structures, they must be formed and put together for a purpose. And then Paley says, therefore, that there is a need for a purposeful and intelligent extrinsic agent who is behind this complexity, order, and functional ends of biological structures. And he gives his famous metaphor of the watch found in the desert, and he says the watch must have had a maker. There must have existed at some time, at some place or other, an artificer or artificers who formed it for the purpose which we find it actually to answer. Now, the difficulty of this argumentation when it is moved into theology is, I believe, an intrinsic tendency of this sort of argument to speak about divine action in univocal terms. Just as there must be a watchmaker who made my watch, who is counting the time, there must be an agent who brings directly in nature this biological complexity that we explore and discover. So we, in a way, this language brings again, or this approach brings a univocal predication about divine action in nature. Now, to be just with Paley, because this argument against him is being made quite often, his view was more sophisticated than we usually say. At least at one point in his book, he says this: whatever is done, God could have done without the intervention of instruments or means, but it is in the construction of instruments that a creative intelligence is seen. God, therefore, has been pleased to prescribe limits to his own power and to work within those limits, it seems, through instruments. Now, Aquinas would not agree with God constraining himself. God doesn't constrain himself when he works through secondary instrumental causes. But it seems that this argument, even if not entirely appropriate, is still brought by Paley. But unfortunately, This is just one place in his book. Generally speaking, the tone of his theology brings a direct divine intervention in nature. Definitely, this type of argumentation is present in the contemporary version of the same argument from design, which is proposed by the intelligent design school or movement, where it is being claimed that where the science does not find natural causes for the apparent cases of complexity, there we need to introduce the agency of intelligent designer, and this is supposed to be. It's supposed. The claim is that this is a scientific claim or a conclusion. So this is design. You can see how different it is from teleology. And then we have this tradition of vitalism, which has its origin back in 17th century, where in response to British mechanicism, especially to Thomas Hobbes, we have a group of so-called Cambridge Platonists. Ralph Cadworth is one of them, and he suggests that there is some sort of non-material but non-intelligent plastic nature, this is the term he uses, a unique cause or principle of living creatures. And he says this, and then it is being developed by other scholars in Great Britain, for example, John Ray, and he does that in relation to the German version of the same argument brought by Caspar Wolff, who is the father of epigenetics. Now, and this is an argument that Darwin is familiar with, we may assume that. The claim is that there is some sort of, some say non-intellectual force, as Cadworth, but others would say maybe some sort of intellectual force, some sort of distinctive spirit that is present in animate creatures, which cannot be verified by natural science. The same argument has its revival in 19th and 20th century. Hans Driesch, in a German-speaking context, also important for science of embryology, and obviously Henri Bergson, who actually brings the idea of élan vital in reference to Darwinian evolutionary theory. So these are the terms that are at play here. And what happens with Darwin? What can we say that happens in Darwin knowing this terminological complexity, okay? So I will now present what is being, like a summary of more recent studies on teleology in Darwin, done by those who are aware of this terminological complexity. So we find those like Michael Gieselin, who is an American biologist, philosopher, and historian of biology, who, in reference to those quotations from Huxley, Francis Darwin, and Asa Gray that I began with, he says this: a myth has grown up today, partly the work of Asa Gray, partly the work of Darwin's son, due to their work, that Darwin somehow brought teleology back into biology. In any non-trivial sense of that word, he did exact opposite, says Gieselin, getting rid of teleology and replacing it with a new way of thinking about adaptation. And yet, other scholars, they say, well, look into the origin of species again and note how often Darwin says things like this: natural selection acts for the good of each being again, and its products are present for various functions, purposes, and ends, right? Sounds like straightforwardly teleological language. Therefore, in trying to offer a meaningful argument in favor of teleology in Darwin, one of the, one of the best if not the best scholar in Aristotle's biology, James Lennox, says this: Darwin essentially reinvented teleology. Encouraged by many close followers to drop the term natural selection, he steadfastly refused this idea. He saw that precisely this natural selection permits the extension of teleology of domestic breeding into the natural domain without the need of conscious design. Again, Lennox says this: in a historical context where once teleological choices were either the goals of goal-directed vital forces, which I've discussed a minute ago, or divinely designed adaptation with God directly changing something in nature such that new organisms may come into existence, no one was prepared in this context where options were precisely these. No one was prepared for Darwin's accomplishment, a selection-based natural teleology. Therefore, Huxley himself, and it is interesting to see how those who claim that there's no place for teleology in Darwin are trying to run away from those claims made by Huxley himself, and it is hard to find Huxley or claim that he was in favor of any sort of theology or theological approach to evolutionary theory. He says this: while Darwin's theory had dealt the death blow to special creation, we must say there is a wider teleology which is not touched by the doctrine of evolution, but is actually based upon the fundamental proposition of evolution. Harry Smith, who works here in Europe, in the Netherlands, who was a biologist, works in ecology and systematics, he says this: Darwin did not replace teleology by evolutionary explanations, but showed that we can understand teleology without referring to a designer. He eliminated the concept of design and rehabilitated Aristotelian teleological explanation, which again, obviously for us doesn't mean that there is no space for God in this explanation, but it is a naturalistic or natural explanation in biology where you don't necessarily have to make any reference to conscious designer who changes anything in nature, and you can still in a meaningful way speak about teleology. Therefore, these are historians of biology and philosophy of biology. But when we go actually to the founding fathers of the 20th century version of evolutionary theory, it's interesting to see the conversation there. Theodosius Dobrzański, he says this: natural selection, with mutation alone, uncontrolled by natural selection, would result in the breakdown and eventual extinction of life, not in the adaptive or progressive evolution. Francisco Ayala, therefore, says this: natural selection is creative in a way. It produces adaptive genetic combinations which would not have existed otherwise. And then he adds, natural selection is teleological in the sense that it produces and maintains end-directed organs and processes. So this is a very strong claim in favor of there being space for teleology in evolutionary theory, which found a reaction, a strong reaction from his friend Ernst Mayr, who is less in favor, who is more cautious, because for him, teleology sounds as this efficient cause from the future acting on what happens right here and right now. And therefore, he says we should be careful and maybe abandon the term teleology and introduce new terminology, which he does. He suggests that we may maybe speak about processes of behavior that owe their directedness or goal-directedness to the operation of a program. This is the time of first computers and all references to this branch of science that is developing. So, and obviously, he says it also in reference to DNA as a source of information in a cell, and teleomatics, more automatic process that reaches an end state caused by natural laws. Yes, I know, thank you. And then the term teleonomy is actually coined by Colin Pittendry, who says this. This is very important. Teleology in Aristotelian form has, of course, at the end as the end as immediate efficient cause, which is not true. But because he understands teleology in this way, he speaks against it. And Ayala, in this entire conversation, in a way succumbs to this criticism, and it's at one point, at least, he says maybe it is possible to translate all teleological claims to non-teleological claims. Others would obviously criticize him and say, well, it speaks against what you have said before. Okay. What is the current status of teleology in philosophy of biology? Well, on the one hand, we have naturalists who speak against teleology. So we still find many, actually, those who claim that it is always an anthropomorphic language that we use and we should abandon it and simply go with a mechanistic explanation in biology. But there are also those, and it's a quite numerous group of philosophers of biology who claim that, well, the deductive nomological and inductive statistical explanations in science are, well, maybe not necessarily entirely replaced, but they should be accompanied in biology not only by genetic, historical, and structural explanation, but also functional and teleological types of explanation. A great philosopher of biology who is in favor of this approach, Dennis Walsh from Canada, says this: teleology is observed in the adaptiveness and phenotypic plasticity of organisms manifested in their self-organizing goal-directedness and capacity to make compensatory changes to form or physiology during their lifetime. And he speaks about the importance of teleology at the level of evolutionary changes, and there's more important scholars who have a similar approach. Now, from the Aristotelian Thomistic point of view, the difficulty we would have with this claim is finding this space for teleology, as Ayala does, for example, and also Darwin, in natural selection. Why so? Well, we may go to William Steger, a Catholic cosmologist and scientist, who says this about laws of nature and natural selection as a law of nature. Although the laws of nature reveal and describe fundamental patterns of behavior and regularities in the world, we cannot consider them the source of those regularities. So it's hard to say that natural selection is teleological as if it was as if it had some purposes to it, because natural selection is not an agent. Rather, nor, says Steger, nor can we ascribe to them the existence independent of the reality whose behavior they describe, because they are descriptive rather than prescriptive. These are imperfect abstract descriptions of physical phenomena and not prescriptions dictating the behavior of phenomena. Therefore, Thomists would say that teleology is indispensable in evolutionary theory and transitions, but it is located not so much in natural selection, but in the fact that to begin with in evolutionary theory, we are dealing with organisms that strive to survive and produce fertile offspring. And this is a teleological activity proper for living beings. Therefore, Moreno and Mosio more recently would say this: if we look for the roots of the impressive capacity of life to proliferate, we shall focus on individual living entities, namely on organisms, before evolution as an explanatory mechanism actually presupposes the existence of organisms, to which I would add that are teleological in their very nature. And the last aspect, and I will finish here, is what we today call the extended theory of evolution, or of evolutionary synthesis in the 21st century, the most recent developments, which offer us much more complex view of nature than the earlier versions of evolutionary theory. And there we find very strong claims such as this. coming from La La Land. He says this: standard evolutionary theory is a gene-centric theory, whereas the contemporary version of evolutionary theory, on the other hand, is an organism-centric theory of evolution, where, again, I would add, we have to pay attention to what organism is in itself and whether it has teleological aspects to it. And according to the same extended theory, genetic inheritance is not the only inheritance system in evolution. Today, we pay attention to development and its relation to evolution, epigenetics, cultural, behavioral, physiological, ecological inheritance, and these are all considered channels of inheritance that can pass traits for the next generations. Therefore, in one of the papers published in 1996 in the area of philosophy of biology, we read this: the evidence for evolution is better than ever, but the role of natural selection in evolution is seen to play less an important role than we thought. No one says that it doesn't play any role, it does. But it is merely a filter for unsuccessful morphologies generated by development. So those other aspects are now being taken into account, and they play an important role in understanding evolution, and they also have a teleological aspect to what they are. Therefore, one more quotation at the end from Dennis Walsh in his piece on teleology in the Oxford Handbook of Philosophy of Biology. He says this: the Aristotelian purge was seen as a pivotal achievement of early modern science. As a consequence of the scientific revolution, the natural sciences learned to live without teleology. But current evolutionary biology demonstrates that quite the opposite lesson needs to be learned. The understanding of how evolution can be adaptive requires us to incorporate teleology, issuing from the goal-directed adaptive plasticity of organisms as a legitimate scientific form of explanation. The natural sciences must once again learn to live with teleology. So if you are interested, the basic literature on teleology and its importance in biology in general, in evolutionary theory, is here. So thank you very much for your time and your attention.
Thank you so very much, and thank you also for your excellent timekeeping.
Thank you.
Thank you. Some questions? Has our speaker flattened you? One here. Would you like to come up, please? Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for interesting talk. I'm not a biologist, I'm a physicist, but okay, in the evolution in general, I would say one problem appears, yes, how to make agreement between the evolution theory in general and then, let's say, with the creation, yes? And I see this point, okay, that it should be the point from which if we believe the evolution would also, was the human being feature, let's say, so in some point we should distinguish between, let's say, more animal, and in some point it should be the district point to say, okay, this is the human being. Now, with this modern considerations that you presented, do you touch this problem,
okay,
or it's still, you know, okay, somehow?
Thank you very much. So I actually will have a book upcoming in October with Cambridge University Press on the contemporary Aristotelian Thomistic approach to evolution. So a number of years of my studies and writing, I put them together in a book. And I actually do this in the first chapter, where I discuss not necessarily teleology, but the model of metaphysical aspects of an evolutionary transition. One of the important questions, obviously, would be the question whether this transition is discrete or it is extended in time such that, as some philosophers of biology would claim, that there is a time when organisms actually do not belong to species A nor to species B. So those who are more into process philosophy of biology would claim this. Now, it obviously brings into equation the question about the notion of species, and it is a can of worms, as we know today. But to answer the question, so I speak from the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition and perspective. We would like to say that species, the transition is discrete, and you cannot not belong to any kind of species. You have to be some kind of thing, and yet probably we would never have an access to this particular discrete event that happens, which doesn't mean that from the philosophical and ontological point of view, it's meaningless to say that it is discrete. And I believe you could defend and say that even if it happens in population, and even if it happens in a way that a number of organisms are going through, let's say, a larger or smaller bottleneck to enter or to start a new species, you could still say that those changes in particular organisms at particular stages of this process are discrete. So therefore, to answer your question, the origin of human being would also be a discrete change from this perspective that I represent, but I am aware of the claim that, and the entire argumentation that says no, it is never discrete. But the question, just one last thing, important thing here that we will have to refer to is understanding again of speciation and the place of population genetics, right? To what extent, because the best tool we have to describe evolutionary transitions are mathematical tools, does that mean that they really give us insight that that is sufficient enough to claim that it happens precisely in this way and it cannot be discrete? Okay, thank you.
Would be time for one quick question if there is.
And quick answer, I promise.
Well, perhaps I'll ask that question then and expect a quick answer. Excuse my philosophical naivety, but some people, including myself, might imagine that with a teleology and a telos, then there might be an end point. Mm-hmm. And would you regard that as a biologically satisfactory description?
End point. Well, again, it will actually, I think, it depends how we define an end, right? Because if we define it as flourishing and success in reproduction and keeping homeostasis and actualizing these positions that you have as an organism, then I would say it can be meaningful also in biology. But if we define the end state as death, no. Right? So it depends on how we define end.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much. Well, if we could re-thank our speaker very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Similar talk.
Thank you.